So, American civil religion is a concept that was introduced and developed by sociologist Robert Bellah in a 1967 article titled Civil Religion in America. He's not the first one to recognize it, but he was the first one to identify it with a name that really stuck, and we still call it that today. His article attracted a great deal of academic attention, and it garnered a fair amount of scholarly debate. Not everyone agrees with him that there is such a thing as American civil religion that's identifiable. Before we turn to Bellah, though, let's go back a bit in time to Alexis de Tocqueville. He was a French diplomat and historian. Many of you will have already met him in history classes or politics classes. He published a book in 1835 called Democracy in America. And here's a pithy quote: "Religion is no less the companion of liberty in all its battles and its triumphs, the cradle of its infancy and the divine source of its claims. The safeguard of morality is religion, and morality is the best security of law and the surest pledge of freedom." Now, we'll get to that and we'll unpack it a bit, but one thing to note at the outset is Alexis de Tocqueville was not a theologian. It was not in his interest to save souls. He was not concerned with one or another religious paradigm. He was a politician, or an observer of politics. He was interested in democracy, and so this was a very pragmatic statement for him. So try to imagine it couched in that frame as we move on. Now, civil religion was first introduced not by de Tocqueville, but in fact by Rousseau in 1762. But for our purposes, we're really going to attend to de Tocqueville, who spent his time in the American context and really developed the concept as we know it today. So he traveled through America in the early 19th century during the era that's come to be known and understood in terms of Jacksonian expansionism, known by the name of President Andrew Jackson. Now, during this time, Americans were moving westward across a geographical body that they did not yet control. Frontiersmanship was the order of the day, industrialism was burgeoning, and with it, the capitalist order that would come to characterize American democracy into the present. A national identity was really being forged, and this isn't, if you want to pause on this map, you might consider the dates associated with these different regions that came under the control of the American federal government during and after the time that de Tocqueville was traveling around. We'll see a map of his travels. He was mostly in the green zone. But this national identity that was being forged during this time, we're going to take a look at that. It was being forged through wars. American Indian wars were rampant at this time, and we remember that President Jackson was himself responsible for the atrocity that's come to be known as the Trail of Tears. So it was a time in American history that was not particularly defensible in a lot of ways in martial terms. It was also, this identity was also being forged in new ways through institutions, a lot of institutions, one of which was the public school system, known then as common schools. The first one opened in 1830. That's the first time the federal government decided that it was worth it to educate the children of poor or working folks. Rich kids had already been going to school, of course. Also, this identity was being forged through industry. The Transcontinental Railroad, which we see a map of here, the first Transcontinental Railroad wouldn't be completed until 1869. Remember, de Tocqueville's writing in 1835, but that movement was already well underway, and the railroad lines are indicative of a westward movement of industrialism. They were connecting factories to markets primarily, or potential markets. Also, this sense of identity was being cultivated through a rugged sort of frontier individualism. This is a very famous painting by Gast known as American Progress. It's often used as the imagistic representation of what's come to be known as manifest destiny. Now, that phrase would not be coined until 1845, 10 years after de Tocqueville's writing, but of course the notion was well established, which is why that phrase took off. Also through a redefinition of individual rights, especially in response to and with respect to the population that had been enslaved on the American continent. So this would lead to the Civil War, but it was at the time really reframing the American identity around these issues. So these are just some of the many things that were going on during this time. The nation was in a time of rapid change in the early to mid 19th century, in ways that it's important to appreciate to see what de Tocqueville was looking at and trying to get at. So de Tocqueville comes from France, which was itself, as a nation, transitioning from an aristocracy to a democracy. And so his perspective was really that of an outside observer interested in how democracy played out, what it looked like, what it did to culture. America was a test case for him. It was an example. He was less interested in the bureaucratic niceties of government, of this form of government, than he was in how this form of government shaped a culture, and how people in this culture understood themselves in relationship to the democratic form of government. What he noticed was this: democracy, as he understood it, was something of a balancing act. That was its primary characteristic. It was the culture had to balance liberty and security. It had to balance individual rights and the common good in ways that we still see today. If you want to look up political cartoons, there are many, many, many political cartoons addressing exactly this issue in contemporary political frameworks. The role of a democratic government for Tocqueville is to limit actions that impinge upon the rights of one or another individual or group of individuals, right? It's not so much to do things as, to actively assert one idea or another. That's not so much the job of a democratic government for de Tocqueville. A democratic government was to be more brakes than gas. It was to be a limiting factor rather than a motivating factor. But what this required, according to de Tocqueville, was a shared culture, a sense of shared culture. Individuals and communities freely choosing to accept common principles, common beliefs, common aims. If it is the government's role to limit, then it is the people's role to act, and to do so in consort with one another. This coming together would forge civil society. That was his notion, according to the mores of which individualism would not have full sway. It would be a real force, but it would be severely limited by the common good and by a shared belief in the values of that civil society. He saw the American character. Remember, it was being forged in very important ways at this time, in ways that we can still see today. But he saw that character as understanding itself to be hardworking, aspiring to economic success in a way that was not the case for the sort of aristocracy, governed systems of France that he was coming from, right? That this notion of economic mobility, like individuals were aspiring towards a success out of their, place, out of their birth order, right? And this American character saw itself as really dignifying the common person, as opposed, again, to the birth categories of an aristocracy, right? Like this, everybody had a sort of value inherently, and working hard could raise that value. And that belief in class mobility really shaped the American character in his mind. It added to a desire for democracy, but it also added to an acquisitiveness and a work ethic that, at least parts of which we can still see today. And he saw American attitudes towards, I should note that he saw American attitudes towards Black Americans and Native Americans as a form of self-defeating hypocrisy. He was extremely critical of the federal responses, both to tribal peoples and to enslaved Africans on the continent, African Americans on the continent. Both groups, he argued, lived under a tyranny of economy and beliefs in racial superiority that ran counter to the commitment to liberty that America espoused. So early on, early 19th century, he said, this is your fatal flaw as a nation, that this shared, set of beliefs, this civil society, was being directly countered in terms of two very large and identifiable populations. Betrayed, not countered. I mean, countered, yes, but betrayed. As to religion, he saw Christianity as foundational to American democracy, believing that political freedom was not possible without a shared moral framework. And in fact, Christianity had a role in sort of, the early colonialist approach to what would become America, and it had a significant cultural influence, if questionable theological influence, upon the framers of the Constitution. In America, it just was a kind of fact accompli, like something that had already happened, right? That the foundation had been provided by especially Protestant Christianity. And he thought that in America, Christianity should be maintained at all costs. He thought it was necessary. Now, again, he wasn't writing as a Christian author. He wasn't a theologian. He wasn't a missionary. He wasn't interested in saving souls at all. He was interested in politics. He thought that politics needed to be supported by some kind of moral authority. Christianity was functioning as this, and he didn't see a likely replacement. So his was a very functional argument, a pragmatic one. He thought societies needed a set of shared beliefs, functionally needed that, in order to act towards shared goals, that as a culture you would not be able to act towards shared goals in a meaningful way without a shared set of beliefs, a shared moral horizon. And he's not particularly partisan about what religion. He just thought that religion was functionally set up to do this. It's what it had long since done traditionally. So we can see some de Tocqueville and Eisenhower sort of famous/infamous quote that Americans need a religion. America needs a religion, and he doesn't care which one it is, and that's so that sensibility has sort of run through into more modern history. De Tocqueville referred to this as, quote, opinions men receive on trust. Of course, he meant women too. A cluster of concepts and practices that speak to a shared sense of meaning, value, and purpose. It's about public morality and about the confidence that individual citizens had in that public morality. Acting according to public morality required that confidence. It required a personal connection. Maintaining freedom, he thought, required that citizens act in the interest of that freedom. Democratic freedom required self-government, and self-government required the limits of a public morality. If we don't believe in the shared moral horizon, de Tocqueville says, then we give away our freedom. He says we, quote, give ourselves a master. We'll look for one. We'll seek one out. If we don't believe in our own connection to a shared moral horizon and responsibility to manifest that for the whole, the common good, even sometimes against our own self-interest, he says, as soon as you stop believing in that, then you find a master, because you can't. This is a good quote. He says, if he has no faith, he's talking about the citizen, right? If he has no faith, then he must serve. And if he is free, then he must believe, right? That freedom required that belief in the underpinnings of freedom, what justified freedom, what founded it, right? Historically, democratic freedom was not the norm. And so in order to act according to it and support it, you had to believe in the reasons for it, right? So truly exercising freedom means believing in the cause, having a moral confidence that inspires action. Committed to freedom as America claimed to be, de Tocqueville saw that Americans would need a civil religion to bind the community and support individual action in the interest of that community's shared goals. Americans would need to hold firm and authentically to their founding principles, such things as, and as you see here, inalienable rights and self-evident truths. So we've got a little quote bottom right from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Any self-evident truth, de Tocqueville recognized, and we recognize today, exists in the realm of mythos. It's not something to be proven. It's something that you believe is true because it compels you, not because you can prove it, right? If truths are self-evident, they're not responsive to proof in that kind of logical way. It doesn't make them more true, doesn't make them less true, makes them a different kind of true. So when we say that all humans are created equal, that clearly cannot be proven. In fact, it can be falsified on any measure, right? Height, strength, weight, emotional intelligence, anything, right? It's patently false in the realm of provability. That's not the point. The point for de Tocqueville and for the Declaration of Independence is that they're self-evident. So this is the foundation of what might become that public morality. If there was to be the possibility of freedom, if there was to be the possibility for pluralism, then these things had to be held to. Individuals, and especially minorities, would be safe to exert their freedom only if the majority truly believed in and acted on the inherent value, worth, and self-determinative rights of every person, right? Otherwise, it will be a majority rule, what he called the tyranny of the majority, which he saw as a great danger for democratic government. It's this, and not a preformed or pre-existing commitment to Christianity per se, that led de Tocqueville to say that, quote, religion should be considered the first of America's political institutions. And this was an observation. He was looking around saying, this is, if you want to describe what's going on the ground, you have to consider religion as the foundation of America's political institutions. Without it, without a strong set of beliefs and a public morality, you wouldn't have democratic self-government. So as a professor of political science, Carson Holloway, puts it, this is a quote, "It is safe to give the," and he's responding to and describing de Tocqueville's vision, "it is safe to give the people power to rule only if they believe that there are moral limits on their power that they must respect, and if their belief in such limits is sustained by their belief in religion." Like, you can't give the people power to rule if they don't feel compelled to rule according to principles, if they don't actually believe in those principles, something outside of the realm of verifiability that they're committed to. That's the claim. So what about today, right? America is different now than it was when de Tocqueville was traveling through it and writing about it. It is more pluralist than it was then. Christianity has lost some of its market value, some of its market share, and the market share that it continues to hold has been fragmented. The 19th century saw the development of many new American Christian groups, including the LDS or the Mormons, Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses, and plenty of others, right? And it also saw, increasingly the normalization or acceptance of Catholic Christianity, which during the time he was traveling was, America was on the whole anti-Catholic. There was rampant anti-Catholicism in a way that we find it hard to imagine at this time. But the common schools that were developed, like, what made the feds decide they had to pay for poor kids to be educated? What made them decide it was the threat of the schools that actually existed on the frontiers. There were schools on the frontiers, but the only people doing the educating were Catholics. There's a bunch of nuns out there educating Protestant frontier kids, and the federal government decided that in order to create that shared civil society, in the context of 19th century rampant anti-Catholicism, you had to have federal schools, which, by the way, were not without religion. The McGuffey readers that were really, kind of governed the day at the time, they were everyone's textbooks. Children learned the ABCs, for instance, through such rhymes as, "In Adam's fall, we sinned all," right? And that's a very theological claim. It's how you learn the letter A during this time, but it was very much from within a Protestant framework. So we are more diverse in that, various forms of Christianity have been accepted, various forms of Christianity have developed. It is not as monolithic, not that it was monolithic at the time, but it is not even as monolithic as it was. Plus, a number of other traditions outside of the frame of Christianity, even outside of the frame of the Abrahamic trio, have been added to the American culture. And maybe most significantly, for de Tocqueville's point, the percentage of Americans who, whether they go to church or not, whether they pray or not, whether they believe in God or not, the percentage of Americans who do not affiliate with religion, who choose not to affiliate with any group, that percentage has grown pretty significantly. Just over 23% of Americans, now claim no religious affiliation. And we refer to those as the nones, as in none of the above. Now, would this suggest to de Tocqueville that American democracy is imperiled? That having no longer a shared religiosity in a way that we can sort of count on, even if it's not true, that can be enforced, that imperils the democratic system? Would de Tocqueville say that it does? Yeah, he might. But remember that de Tocqueville's point is decidedly not theological. He's not making claims about which religion is true, or even if any of them are. That's not the point. His point is political. It's not about which traditional institution is right. It's about which public morality is functional. And that public morality, that shared moral horizon, we refer to that as American civil religion. So back to Bella, with whom we began, and who wrote an article in 1967 that introduced us to that phrase, American civil religion. In that essay, he identified and illustrated through a selection of examples what he called, quote, "a well-institutionalized civil religion in America, a public religious dimension that is expressed through a set of beliefs, symbols, and rituals." And that he calls American civil religion. Much like de Tocqueville, Bella thinks of religion here in a functionalist way. It's not about official institutionalized religious status. It's like we see in and readily attribute to churches, temples, and mosques. It's not about that. It's about trying to understand what, if anything, unifies the increasingly diverse, increasingly pluralist, and, in our own time, increasingly non-religiously affiliated, trying to understand what, if anything, unifies that population. What might function as that public morality that de Tocqueville talked about, and also what might exist as material expressions of that public morality. And as you might imagine, Bella thinks there is such a thing as, as civil religion, probably in every nation or social group, but he really focuses on America. So let's think for a second about America's beliefs, symbols, and rituals. Bella spent most of his seminal essay, the one that sort of started this whole conversation in 1967, looking closely at presidential speeches. He focused especially on JFK's inaugural address, and the narrowly focused lens that he used has been both widely critiqued and too often followed by subsequent scholars. American civil religion is not, as Curly Penter reminds us, it is not a distinct and explicit institution of any kind. Right? It is, as Bella first suggested, a cluster of beliefs, symbols, and rituals that Americans use to understand themselves in relation to the past and to the future, to the cosmos and to the community. The book on the far right, Peter Gardella's American Civil Religion, is recent. It's from the last couple few years. It's available through our library as an ebook. You can get the whole text online, and it is the best. So far, the best job that's been done at not focusing too narrowly on presidential speeches, right? Like, okay, those are great, but how much do they really organize my sense of self? Sure, every president has to mention God, right? Like, that just seems a no-brainer in our current context. You might use the current president, Donald Trump, who, think whatever you will about him, doesn't have much of a religious past, but it was very important for him, even him, to situate himself as a Christian, as a proud Christian, a defender of the Christian faith, right? So it is written into American democratic engagement to this day that yes, presidents must acknowledge a relationship to Christianity. They seem to have to. Nobody gets away with not doing that. You can think back to Obama and how important it was that he be pictured in church to prove that he wasn't a Muslim somehow, and which was part of the argument online, but also that he be seen in church not with Reverend Jeremiah Wright, like that there's a kind of Christianity. It's got to be the right kind of Christianity, right? That it does functionally participate that way. But moving away from this explicit Christianity, Peter Gardella does an excellent job of looking more broadly at what in fact what constitutes this cluster of beliefs, symbols, and rituals that often go unnoticed, that are often taken for granted, but that help to form the cultural fabric of contemporary America, and that once you see, you sort of can't unsee. They're everywhere. It's kind of like the air we breathe, right? What Daniel Quinn would call mother culture, right? That you don't notice it's there. It's like the fish in the water, right? What water? How's the water? What water? How's your culture? What culture, right? A couple points. American civil religion is separate from and intentionally not in conflict with the churches, temples, and mosques of traditional religion. Its central beliefs include freedom and its very close kin, liberty. Some will talk about the difference between the two. Justice, equality, a set of ideals to which Americans claim to aspire, right? We might have progress up there. We might have ingenuity. Another central belief is the belief in American exceptionalism, right? That this nation is would be as a city upon a hill, in the words of John Winthrop, who gave a speech aboard ship in 1630 to those about to disembark, and explained to them what their purpose was in this new colonial frame. And it was that we would be a city upon a hill, teaching the nations of the world to walk in the ways of liberty, as President Wilson said in the early 20th century. And Reagan really revived the language, calling the U.S. a shining city on the hill. Obama highlighted the possibility of progress by talking about the city on the hill as still under construction. The way we've understood this exceptionalism has changed throughout history. But with precious few exceptions, each era has overwhelmingly believed that American values are universal values, that representative democracy, individual rights, free market, that those should be exported, right? So you get this is just something I found online. You look up American exceptionalism and you see this, and it's clearly critical, right? American exceptionalism, the greatest income inequality, highest poverty rate, greatest number of children in poverty, like it just goes on, right? These are all critiques, but the critiques themselves don't question the values that are held exceptionally dear. Like the problem is we're not meeting them, and that's why this right hand American flag image that's why it's so punchy and critical, is because it still holds those American values of individual rights, free market, representative democracy, equality, all of those things stated in the preamble and the Declaration, those foundational value documents, not so much legislative documents, but assertions of value, that those are being betrayed. That's what makes this critical. It's not questioning the exceptional nature of those values themselves. It's questioning the degree to which we've met them. So with precious few examples, every era has seen, including today's, on any part of this political spectrum, right? Americans still see the American project as exceptional. So that's part of this cluster. As the architects of the global war on terror, our nation's longest war, by the way, now 20 years in, 42% of Americans do not know that we are still at war in Afghanistan. This strikes me as egregious. But as the architects of the global war on terror variously put it, America must either change the way we live or change the way they live. And we choose overwhelmingly, as each of these architects said in different ways, we choose to change them. And in doing that, to root out evil from the world, right? That it remains America's exceptional task, responsibility, destiny, calling, purpose, whatever, to build that city on the hill and to export it, right? And that comes from the left as from the right, whether you're talking about human rights and the equality of women and the, literacy rates, child mortality rates, like all of those things, the protection of minorities, or you're coming from the right, and you're kind of more into the removing of evil through martial realms, or the neoliberalism that says capitalism is freedom and we should export that. It still remains entrenched in nearly every aspect of the American political spectrum that America's purpose is exceptional, and that exporting that purpose is our destiny, right? It's a bold claim. It always has been, and rooting out evil from the world makes it especially notably bold, right? And we could talk at length about that, but I want to close out this consideration of American beliefs to make quick mention also of the symbols and rituals. Now, symbols, easily we're looking at the flag, right? The Mall on Washington, the White House increasingly, and its occupant. The symbolic importance of the president has not always been what it is now. That's a pretty recent, the last, few administrations, post-Cold War era, or maybe Cold War era. We could talk about that. But, the eagle maybe, but I didn't even put it up here. Probably a gun and a horse and an American muscle car, right? Probably those are somewhere deep in the kind of soul of America as a nation, as it symbolizes and imagines itself. Altogether symbolizing the sort of ruggedly independent mobility of the long-gone frontier. And symbols change. What these symbols represent, we see this more clearly now, is a very Anglo America, right? And that's changing. So think about statues, right? Statues are symbolic representations, and we can see through statues and at the bottom, the number of graffiti moments of the Statue of Liberty being changed and represented in different ways is astounding right now. It's amazing. You should go do a little quick Google search. This is one. It's not the only one. But think about the statues and what stays up as representative and what comes down, and the questions increasingly asked of who's being represented and what they're being represented for, what that says about American beliefs and how those representations ought to change. This is the question of whether or not taking down statues is right or wrong, putting them up is right or wrong, is a secondary question, right? That's not what I'm pointing to here. What I'm pointing to here is the degree to which statues themselves manifest our physical, symbolic representations of American beliefs or values, and the degree to which it is a contentious issue right now. The challenges around those representations indicate clearly that these beliefs or values are central, and that they're being reimagined or reshaped during our era. Wherever you fall on it, this is what this indicates. Now, Okay, so there's symbols. Let's talk about rituals really briefly, right? The election cycle is hard to ignore. It comes with much, increasingly, much pomp and circumstance. So there's that, right? There's also the Pledge of Allegiance. This is, this is a clear ritual of American, like to pledge allegiance is a religious act, right? And we might note that the Supreme Court recognized in 1947 the religious aspect of this ritual when they decided in favor of the Jehovah's Witnesses, who objected to their child's being required in school to say it, to participate in this ritual, on the grounds of religious freedom. They said, I don't want my kid to have to pledge allegiance to a secular symbol. That's a religious act. Supreme Court said, yeah, you're right. That's a religious act. So you have in 1947 a very explicit decision that says American civil religion is a thing. This is one of its rituals. We cannot force you to participate. Now, it remains a significant ritual for a good chunk of Americans. It remains said today. This 4-year-old is getting some press in the pandemic world because he's led a flag salute every morning, and people are now tapping in from around the country. So it retains its ritual symbolism, right? And it's worth noting that school children across America do say this, that they pledge allegiance to to an image that is a symbol that is, for which it stands, and the republic for which it stands. That you've got very small children precognitively, like not to the point of considering what allegiance might mean, who are schooled. This is how cultures, the early schooling in values that create culture. This is one of those instances. Now, just a little history, because it has been a kind of, inflammatory moment. It's worth knowing that until 1942, when Hitler's Nazis made this particular salute, unpalatable to the American audience, it's known as the Bellamy Salute, and it was how school children pledged allegiance to the flag until 1942. From the Pledge of Allegiance began in 1892 as part of this, quadricennial, is that right? 400 years celebration of, Columbus in 1492. So in 1892, the Pledge of Allegiance was introduced. 1942 is when it shifted to a hand over the heart from what now very much symbolically, visually cues us into Nazi Germany, so we could no longer participate in that symbolic representation, and therefore the hand went over the heart. About 12 years later in 1954, when America was in the throes of the Cold War, and it was, capitalism versus communism, first world versus second world, that is the point at which Under God was added to the pledge. It had not been there before, but it was added in very intentionally in order to distinguish Americans from the godless communists against whom they saw themselves in a cosmic battle. Another ritual that we might know is the anthem, this Demi Lovato, of course. Now, we've seen through Kaepernick and others how this ritual is, being called into active consideration with the beliefs it's said to voice and the degree to which those beliefs are manifested, right? We've seen that this is being called into question, and B, clearly an important, deeply meaningful, more or less sacred ritual, right? It's been shown to be both those things through the protest initiated by Kaepernick, really carried out by others as well. And you see in the background variations on this. You've seen variations on this, many people, and it happens especially at sporting events where it is ritually common to sing the anthem before sporting events. It's the time when you get people all watching together and create a sense of, what de Tocqueville would call civil society. That's a high moment of it. That's when you can get everyone together to do this. And in those moments, you do see enacted a number of, supporting, challenging, a number of responses to this ritual, what it symbolizes, and the beliefs it is said to voice, and the degree to which our actions match those beliefs. That's the conversation. The fact that the conversation has become as hot button issue as it is, the fact that people care as much as they do, they get upset as much as they do, they support it as much as they do, shows us, it indicates to us that this is a moment of sacred for. This is a sacred performance for America. If it wasn't, it would never have been the site of dissent, and it would never, the fact that it became a site of dissent would not have mattered to the public conversation. It did. But we see that there's nuance to the way that that descent has happened. The taking of a knee is one. Worth noting that that was an intentional, you can look this up, but that was an intentional choice, the knee, as opposed to just sitting on the bench in order to indicate respect. It's not how it came off, as it turns out, to the majority of the public who are against this particular form of descent. They don't care that it was meant to be respectful. It's just taken as disrespectful. But you see that the fist in the air is one way. To stand next to your teammates with your hand on their shoulder while your other hand is on your heart, that's one way. I mean, there's been a variety of responses to this. Some would say in the world of rituals that we should consider national holidays. You can consider national holidays as rituals of American civil religion. They're kind of like, latently Christian. Most of them are Christian. Half of them are Christian, half of them are patriotic. But, as functional manifestations, they don't seem to carry the weight, to me. Reasonable people might disagree, but they don't seem to carry the weight of either the anthem or the pledge. They just seem to be days off of work where, if anything, we all together manifest our commitment to capitalism, which is something we could consider. But what's the point? Does American civil religion exist? And if it does exist, does it matter, right? These are the questions. I'd suggest that, yes, it does exist. And that de Tocqueville, he might be right, that a democratic government needs, that it requires a public morality, a shared moral horizon. Now, America has this. It's less tied to Christianity than it once was. It's never been perfectly manifested or lived into, but it's there. It's readily available, and in principle, it's agreed on by most Americans. We hold certain truths to be self-evident, to be outside of the scope of proof, right? That all people are created equal, endowed by the fact of their existence with certain inalienable rights. That the role of government is to provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. On the whole, Americans, in principle, agree with that. The disagreements, as we've seen, come when one or another individual or group feels that the balance between individual rights and the common good is not being met, that there are some who are not benefiting from the promises made by the ideals to which we all claim adherence. How to go about doing those things, providing for the common defense, promoting the general welfare, securing the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. How to go about doing those things is an open question. That these beliefs have been neglected, that they've been betrayed throughout the nation's history is unquestionable, right? That's in the realm of fact. But de Tocqueville would say, and Bellow would agree, that moving in consort towards a better future requires that we, A, recognize the moral authority of a civil religion, whatever it is. That is, that we not pretend that it doesn't exist, that we see it, that we acknowledge it, that we give voice to it, that we identify it. And B, that we hold ourselves and each other, our communities and our elected representatives, that we hold ourselves and each other accountable to the values, beliefs, and principles that are enshrined in that civil religion or civil society. We will turn next, I'll record one more lecture, and we will turn next to the role of the military within American civil religion, which is historically and continues to be quite significant.